And let's keep working and actually finish our hero section. And this is where we left off. And what we want to do now is to vertically center this box, which has all of this content, right? But at the same time, keeping this navigation bar here at the very top. So let's explore different ways of actually doing that. And probably the first thing that comes to mind would be Flexbox, right? So let's try out if that would be a good fit. So basically applying Flexbox here on the entire header. So let's see. Display, Flex, and then in order to vertically center, align items and center. So let's see. But that would of course first put these two elements side by side and then vertically center them. So it looks nice on this one here, but it does not look good on the navigation bar because we actually want this one to stay at the very top. And so Flexbox is probably not the best way here to go. Now, in order to solve this, there are actually multiple ways. So there are multiple ways in which we can achieve this layout, so this design here that we want. But the one that we're going to use is to basically vertically center this box here using that trick that I showed you earlier with absolute positioning and then using the transform function with translate. So remember that? So I actually showed you a diagram back then. And so now let's do the same thing here. So this one we don't need. And instead, what we now want is to center this element here. So this container. And so actually we need to give this here a different class name. So this should now be different because of course it's absolutely centered. And so the styles that we need are different than the ones from the container. So let's call this one here the header container. Copy this. And after the navigation, which is how it looks like in the code. And we still want the width to be 1200 pixels. So that is the same. But now remember, we want to position it absolutely. Position absolute. And let's start here by putting it at left 50% and right 50%. Because remember that we actually want to center this element, right? And so 50% is kind of the middle. But of course, we then will need to use the transform function as well. But for now, let's take a look at what it looks like this. And so let's even give us some background color here again. And let's say violet. All right. So it did move already 50% here of the parent element to the right, but not to the bottom. And I think that is because we forgot to actually set the relatively positioned container. So we want this element here to be absolutely positioned inside of the header, right? And so never forget to then set the position to relative on that one. So, well, actually here we also have a mistake. So of course it needs to be 50% from the left and from the top, not from the right. That would not work. No, right? So basically at this point here, it is now 50% from the top and from the right. And remember that these 50% are in relation to the parent element. So it's 50% of this parent element here to the bottom, and also 50% of this parent element's width here to the right. Okay, and so now we need to fix that by basically moving it up a little bit back so that it's actually in the middle. So I hope you remember this technique, and if not, you can always go back and look at that slide with that visual explanation that I showed you. But what we will do now is to use the transform property with the translate function. And then we will move it back up 50% of the element's width and of the element's height. So minus 50 in both cases right here. And again, I will write it down here that these are in relation to the element size, while these two are in relation to the parent size. And so that is the reason why this works and why it looks beautifully like this now. So if we change this, well, at least up to these 1200 pixels, then it stays nicely in the center. And actually it will stay in the center forever. And of course, also the same vertically. So you see, it always really stays in the top, even if it has to overlap this navigation bar here and this extreme situation. Okay, so this is exactly what we wanted. So that's amazing. And now comparing it to this one here, you see that here actually the text kind of finishes here, like it looks like in the middle of the page, right? So that maybe looks like it's a little bit difficult to achieve, but actually it's very easy. So basically what we want is to simply have another container here. And so that element will then simply occupy 50% of the width. And so that will then contain these elements, right? And so by doing that, we basically leave some space here for her face and for this part here of the background image. And then we have this text here beautifully on top of this blurred part. So that's why I chose to put the text and all this content here really on the left side. Okay. Of course, there could be other design decisions. So I also showed you that we could actually center the text, which is what some websites do. And just as an aside, this would be very easy. All we would have to do is on the container element. So the container element of those text elements, here we would simply have to do text align center. And so this would work quite nice if the image was different. So basically, if the focus point of the image was down here in the bottom, for example, then this would work perfectly. But that's not the case. So let's comment that out. And then, as I was saying, we will simply create another element right here. So let's call this the header container inner. Okay, then moving that down. So header container inner, let's put it right here. And as I was saying, all we have to do is give this one a width of 50%, which is again in relation to the parent element. So it will essentially be 600 pixels, so half of 1200, but let's start to get used to using percentages for this kind of thing. Now just some background color very quickly, just for debugging, and there we go. So the contrast here is quite bad, but we can see that actually this worked. So now this is the container for the text, which occupies exactly 50% of this bigger container. All right. And so in the end, achieving a layout like this is all about thinking about these boxes and how we want them to be laid out and to be displayed in our website, right? So really, it's all just a matter of logically thinking about these boxes and to push them around until in the end, they are exactly where we want them to be. Now let's just remove some of the line height here in this heading. Looks a little bit off. Let's use something really small, 1.05. And finally, let's get rid of all of these background colors so that now we can finally add our beautiful background image there. So let's see. And there we go. Beautiful. So this is what we're looking for. So all we're missing is this background color. and then of course setting this text to white, but that is very easy. So that background image should be the background of this entire header element, right? And so this is where we can now define, for the first time ever, the background image property. And now to specify the image, we need to write URL and then open and close parentheses. And then here we need to specify the path of the image in relation to our current file. And so in this case, that is simply hero. So just right here, hero.jpg. And we don't even need any quotes here around this image path. So all we need is to add this and we're good. And you already see the image being loaded up here in the gutter, which means that this path is correct. So we will have this background image now already, but it will not look as expected, as you see. So this image is in fact huge, and so therefore we only can see a small part of that image right now. Right? So these lights that we see here are basically, well, it's just this small part here of the website somehow. Right? And so therefore we now need some way of shrinking that image down. But fortunately for us, there is a nice and handy property, which is called the background size. And here there are a couple of different options, and mainly those are contain and cover. But I usually, and I think everyone, most of the times just uses cover. And what this value of cover here will do is to figure out automatically the exact size that the image needs to be to cover, as the name says here, the entire element. And so now, as we check this out, it looks a lot better. And so as we resize, you will see that always the image covers the element, no matter what we do. All right. So this looks great already, but there is still a crucial difference here. And that difference is that here we actually have this dark overlay over this image, right? So remember from one of our web design sections that when our image is too light, in order to actually make the text readable, we can, as one of the options, make the image a little bit darker. And so that's what this darker overlay here is all about. So of course right now our text is even still gray. So let's make it white here in the first place, so we can actually see what we need to do. So just like this. And I mean, technically we could read it, right? But still it looks kind of off. There's not enough contrast here right now between this text and this image. So it's quite confusing. And so we need to darken down that image. Now doing that is not really trivial. So it is a bit harder than it might seem. So you might have thought that there was some simple property that would simply do that, but in fact there is not. Instead, what we need to do is to basically create a stack of background images where the first background image is a gradient that is transparent. So that sounded a little bit confusing, so let me actually show you how it works. And actually to do this, let's create a gradient somewhere else just so you see how the syntax works. So to create a gradient, we still use the background image. And then we use the linear gradient function like this. So linear-gradient, and then we can specify two colors. So let's say red and blue. Okay, just to test a very simple gradient. And so you see, now we do have this gradient going from red to blue. Okay, so that's the very basic syntax of the linear gradient. And we can do some more stuff like changing the direction. For example, we can say to right. So as a first option here, I think this is how it works at least. And yeah, so now it goes from red to blue, from left to right. Okay, But anyway, we will explore gradients a little bit more in the next section, but I just wanted to show you how they work. And that's important because, as I said, we actually need a linear gradient to make a background image darker. So this is kind of a strange trick, so let me show it to you. So here in the same background image, we will now specify a linear gradient, and then with a comma, we basically specify a second image. So this is kind of a stack where this background image here, which is this gradient, is on top of this one. And we could, in fact, specify many different background images even, not just one or two. So again, this will create a stack where this one is on top and this one here is on the bottom. But now, what colors are we actually going to use? Well, we want to make the image darker, right? And so let's start with black. So 0, 0, 0. And then the other value, let's make it also black. So that is the trick here. So it is to make both colors here the same. But of course, we don't want absolute black, because then we would get this, okay? So we want some opacity here, so some RGBA. So let's do that by clicking here on the title again. And so we already had it actually. So let's put this here like to 0, 6. And then let's do the same here for the second color. And now we should actually get a usable result. Well, not quite actually. Let's go back here. That's because I did not delete the hash here. But here we go. So that's beautiful, right? And yeah, it is the same color here all over the image. Again, because we made the gradient go from one color to the second one, which are both exactly the same. But of course, it wouldn't have to be that way. We can specify some other, let's say just some random colors here, just to see that in this case, of course, we could go from black to this kind of blue color here, right? But of course, we don't want that. We want them to be the same, but let's just use some kind of gray here, which looks a little bit better than just pure black usually. But again, that is a design decision that you have to take. So of course you can use pure black, but I think using some shade of gray here looks a little bit better. So it gives us this kind of softer touch here. And so I think now we actually have the exact same design as in our final result. There's just some spacing here going on. So let's add that. So that's in the navigation. So here. And let me actually show you how to not do it. So let's say margin top 32 pixels. So why do you think that is not going to work as intended? And well, nothing happened here. Let's inspect why that is. So here we have our margin top of 32 pixels, but it is actually crossed out. And that's because here from the container, we get margin top and bottom of 0. And so remember our priorities. So a class selector has more priority than a simple element selector. And so that's why this one here overrides this one. But here in the developer tools, we can actually also set styles right here. And so here, this element style will basically set them right here as inline styles. And so remember that those have an even higher priority. So just to experiment. So margin top 32 pixels. So you see now it's set that here and is now overwriting that 0. Now I mentioned that I wanted to show you why this doesn't work. And the reason is that now this actually will create an empty space outside of the box, right? And so that will then therefore create this white space here on top. So that's obviously not what we want. So we want to go with padding instead. So let's see. And there we go. And with that, we actually finished this header component. So a lot of new CSS we learned here. And in particular, we learned how to set this background image here. We learned about the background size. And also we learned about this new VH unit. And also, and probably even more importantly, we kept thinking about how to achieve the layouts that we wanted using the code tools that we have at this point. So teaching you that is probably my most important goal here, because looking up properties is very simple, but learning how to think about how to create a layout exactly like this with all the properties that we would like it to have is not so easy to look up on the web. And so I hope that with all these exercises and all these small projects, you are starting to get better and better at that. But anyway, that wraps up this small mini project. And so now there's only one more component or one more layout to build in this section. And so I hope to see you there soon.